on a bleak winter morning, while the city was still drenched in the scent of baked goods and the soft echo of Christmas music drifting through warm glass windows. A lone figure sat huddled on the sidewalk near a bus stop, a homeless man wrapped in a worn coat, scruffy beard, and eyes as clouded as fog. No one knew that beneath the torn wool hat and hole-ridden gloves was Lucien Valencourt, the man who once made Wall Street hold its breath with a single nod. He was no longer the powerful CEO, no longer the man who could sway markets with one meeting. He was now a man crushed by his past, no longer believing in titles or triumphs. In his hands was a faded photograph, a woman with a gentle smile and a newborn wrapped in white cloth. 22 years ago, he lost them both in one night, forced to choose between his career and a love deemed beneath him during a family meeting filled with steel-cold faces and voices that left no room for doubt. He signed, he walked away, and from that moment on, his heart never slept again. There were times he thought he could forget, that time would blur memories like fog. But it didn't. The more he succeeded, the emptier he felt. The higher he climbed, the further he fell each night inside himself. Now beneath the shell of a homeless man, amid biting winds and pitiful glances from strangers, Lucien sat not to beg for bread, but to reclaim a fragment of his soul, long lost. He didn't know what his daughter's face looked like now. He didn't know if she hated him, if she ever asked, "Who is my father?" if she had ever looked up at the sky, wishing just once to meet him. But deep down, Lucien was afraid. Afraid that when he finally stood before her, all he would see was indifference in her eyes. Afraid that his cowardice had killed his only chance to be a father. And even if the world thought he was mad, he remained there, hoping for a miracle, for a fleeting moment, for the one sentence he had longed to hear his whole life: "I'm Aria, and I forgive you." Across the street, from where Lucien sat in silence every day, there was a small cafe called Maison Luna, not luxurious, not noisy, but always radiating a gentle light like the warmth of a kind heart. There, Aria Leclerc worked part-time as a waitress, wearing a pale blue apron, her hair neatly tied in a bun at the nape of her neck, her eyes always carrying a trace of fatigue, yet never losing their gentle glow. Aria was unlike the other employees. She didn't chatter with customers, never complained even after consecutive early shifts. To her, making each cup of coffee at just the right temperature, pulling each tray of pastries from the oven just right, was her way of preserving dignity in a simple life that others might think wasn't worth dreaming about. No one knew that after each shift, she would save a bag of leftover pastries, not out of thrift, but because she knew someone out there might need a little bit of simple warmth. And the most familiar recipient was the old beggar sitting across the street. Aria never asked his name, never inquired about his past. She simply placed the bag on the wooden bench each morning, along with a scribbled note: "Eat it while it's warm. It's cold today." To others, it was a small, even foolish gesture. But to Lucien, it was the first fragile thread connecting him to the daughter who had never once called him father. Aria had no idea that every time she bent down to tuck the pastry bag into the drawer, the man turned his face away, afraid her eyes might recognize something familiar. She also didn't know that a hand trembled every time it saw her handwriting, identical to the script of the woman in the faded photograph he still kept. Aria was not wealthy. She had to count every penny just to buy medicine for her elderly neighbor. But in a world growing colder with selfishness, she was one of the few who still planted kindness quietly, without asking for anything in return, without seeking recognition. And it was that very silence, that stirred a heart-long thought to be frozen by regret. That day, rain came without warning. Tiny droplets clung to the windows of Maison Luna, forming a misty veil. Aria had just finished clearing a table when she glanced out the window and saw the familiar old beggar huddled under the awning across the street, his thin coat soaked through, clutching the same worn-out bag as always. Without much thought, she quickly grabbed a freshly baked pastry bag from the drawer, added a dry napkin, and dashed outside, her hair damp with each hurried step. She placed the bag on the bench beside him, ready to walk away as she always did. But this time, he spoke. His voice was hoarse, low, and unexpectedly steady, making her freeze in her tracks. "Aren't you afraid? You might be helping the wrong person." The question wasn't accusatory. It felt more like a test, a quiet probe, as if he were trying to confirm something even he wasn't sure of. Aria turned back slightly surprised, then offered a gentle smile, a smile free of caution, free of calculation. "I'd rather be fooled than pretend I don't see someone who needs help." Lucien stared at her for a long moment. The steely grey eyes, once sharp enough to weigh million-dollar decisions, now softened as though every word she spoke carved into the wall he'd built around his heart for over 2 decades. It wasn't a clever response. It was an honest one, and to him, that was worth more than any carefully measured words in the world of finance. For a fleeting moment, he wanted to ask more about her name, where she grew up, and the woman who had raised such a kind-hearted girl. But he didn't dare. He knew. If he asked too soon, he might ruin the one fragile chance he was clinging to. So he simply nodded, for the first time in years, whispering a silent thank you that never reached his lips. And Aria, with the grace of someone who never expected anything in return, just smiled and turned away, as if helping others was the most natural thing one human could do for another. And Lucien felt fear for the first time. Fear that if he lost this chance, he might never again have the right to call anyone daughter. Lucien sat alone on the worn-out bench, the sound of raindrops tapping steadily on the awning above him like a ticking clock counting down to something important. His hands gently clutched the bag of pastries Aria had just given him, as if inside it wasn't just food, but a piece of her heart, carefully wrapped and offered without a word. He looked up quietly, following Aria's figure as she walked back into the cafe, her stride strong, yet tinged with solitude. And then he saw what made his chest tighten until he could barely breathe: her eyes. Eyes that were both tender and deep, exactly like the woman he had lost all those years ago. Her voice soft but unwavering. That smile, not forced, not masked, but so sincere, it made others ashamed of their indifference. Aria had no idea that with just one seemingly simple sentence, she had awakened an entire vault of memories he had tried to bury for 20 years. A part of him long buried under ambition, cold boardrooms, and decisions stripped of emotion, broke open. Lucien turned his face away, not because of the cold, not out of shame, but because he couldn't let her see the tears falling, his first tears in 20 years, since the night he walked away from that hospital, leaving behind the woman he loved, cradling their newborn daughter, begging him to stay. He left that night for what he believed was the future, but that future had never been whole without the gaze he had just seen today. Now, he didn't need a DNA test. He didn't need a private investigator. He had seen with his heart, and he knew Aria was his daughter. That gentleness, that integrity, that unwavering look that didn't flinch in the face of a beggar. They were the legacy of the woman he had once loved with every beat of his youth. Lucien Valencourt, the man who didn't shed a tear, even when he lost his entire company in a ruthless merger, now sat motionless in the afternoon rain, letting those bitter tears trail down his weathered face. Because for the first time in his life, he wasn't a CEO, he wasn't a billionaire, he was just a father, staring at the most precious thing he had ever been foolish enough to let go. That afternoon, Maison Luna was quieter than usual. The rain had just stopped, but the cold lingered in the air, leaving long streaks of water smeared across the cafe's doorstep. Aria was wiping down the tables, eyes glancing every so often toward the familiar street corner where the old beggar usually sat. But today, he wasn't there. A strange emptiness settled over her, as if someone familiar had fallen out of step with the rhythm of the city. And then, the doorbell chimed softly. He walked in. For the first time, he didn't sit under the awning. He walked straight to the counter and ordered a black coffee. His hoarse voice made Aria freeze. Somehow she knew she could no longer see him as just someone in need. As he stepped away from the counter, almost casually, Lucien dropped an old wallet onto the tiled floor. It opened slightly, revealing a worn photograph, a young woman with gently curled hair, sorrowful eyes, and a smile so tender it could break hearts. Aria bent down to pick it up. Her hands trembled as she recognized the face. It was unmistakable. That was her mother. "Wait," she called out quickly, following him to the door. "Sir, why do you have a photo of my mother?" Lucien stopped in his tracks. He knew this moment would come, but hearing that voice, the very same tone as the woman who once whispered, "Lucien, I believe you'll come back," it made his heart seize. He turned around his eyes, holding a silence that was almost terrifying. Not rushed, not surprised. Just a gaze that spoke of someone who had waited a lifetime to hear that question. "Are you sure?" he asked back, his voice as rough as stone. "What's your mother's name?" Genevieve Leclerc. Aria replied, her heart pounding. Lucien gave a slight nod, saying nothing more. He retrieved the wallet, took the photo, and gently tucked it back into his coat pocket, like someone protecting a memory too fragile to be touched. Then he spoke a single sentence that made the air in the cafe feel like it had stopped. "There are people we've lost, but never stopped searching for." And then he turned and walked away. Aria stood, frozen, her hand clutching the edge of her apron, her heart flooding with 100 questions. Why did he have a photo of her mother? Who was he, and why did his voice tremble when he said Genevieve's name, like a wound that had never been allowed to heal? She didn't know it yet, but that moment was a test. A cold, deliberate test wrapped in love. And her reaction had just become the first key unlocking a truth on the verge of erupting. Aria stood frozen after the old beggar turned his back and walked out of the cafe. Her heart pounded wildly and her throat tightened. She had never seen him carry anything of value aside from the pastry bag she gave him, and yet today he had a photograph of her mother, the very photo she believed existed only in a single copy. Locked away in a keepsake box her mother had hidden deep at the bottom of the wardrobe. Inside, her emotions swirled like a storm. Chaos, confusion, and finally, anger. Anger that someone had dared to touch the most sacred part of her memory. Anger at the terrifying familiarity in his eyes. Anger because no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't a stranger. That same afternoon, just as he was walking away, she ran after him. Her voice cut like a blade, though her eyes glistened with a mixture of fury and fear. "Who are you? Why do you have my mother's photo? Where did you steal it? Beggars don't get to play memory games with other people's lives." Lucien said nothing. He didn't protest. didn't explain. He simply nodded once, quietly, almost reverently, as if he had already accepted every accusation from his own daughter, though she had no idea yet who he truly was. Arya turned back and slammed the cafe door shut, her hand trembling with each breath. For the rest of her shift, she was clumsy, dropping glasses, mixing up orders, her heart tightening under a pressure far heavier than anger fear. Fear that if what he said, or didn't say, was true, the entire inner world she'd carefully built over the years of a strong single mother of a childhood without a father would come crashing down. That night, Arya couldn't sleep. She opened her wardrobe and pulled out the old wooden box, one her mother had once said, "Only open it when you truly need answers." Her hands trembled as she lifted the lid. Inside were fragments of memory, a newborn's cloth, a few unsent letters, and a photograph. Her mother holding a baby Arya, standing beside a man in a grey suit with deep-set eyes and a stern expression that couldn't quite hide the tenderness in his gaze. Arya sat still, stunned. The man in the photo was the very beggar from today. She leaned back, clutching the box to her chest, her heart constricting. Every question, every reaction, every burst of anger suddenly dissolved into something else, something larger, deeper, the shattering of belief, and a longing she had never allowed herself to name. And that night, for the first time in years, Arya wept for a father she had never been allowed to remember. The next morning, the city sky was a cold grey mirroring Arya's mood. She left home earlier than usual, no makeup, no morning coffee, carrying only one question that had burrowed into her heart after a sleepless night. The old photograph was still tucked in her coat pocket, the edge slightly bent from being clenched too tightly. She was no longer as furious as the day before, but the turmoil hadn't faded. She needed answers, not to satisfy curiosity, but to understand the crack, now splitting the emotional wall she once thought unbreakable. She went straight to the familiar place, the weathered bench outside Maison Luna, and he was still there as if he had never left. Lucien looked at her. He didn't speak, didn't smile, didn't flinch. Arya took a deep breath, then sat beside him, keeping a respectful distance, as though some invisible thread still held them apart. Her eyes locked onto his face, but her voice trembled, ready to shatter. "If you really are my father, then why did you never try to find me?" The question struck like a blade, not meant to wound, but to cut through the silence. Lucien didn't answer right away. His eyes lowered, as if burdened by memories far heavier than any legacy he'd ever possessed. Then, without a word, he pulled an old envelope from his coat and placed it gently in her hand. No pressure, no defense. "This is a will, hidden for 20 years. Your mother once tried to send it to court, but it never reached the lawyer." Arya opened the envelope with trembling fingers. Slanted handwriting appeared her mother's name, her signature, and the name of the sole heir, Arya Genevieve Leclerc. Attached was a short note, written in ink now fading. "In the event of my death, all custodial rights and related assets for the child shall belong to Lucien Valencourt if he dares to return." Arya gripped the paper, her heartbeat spiraling. If he dares to return, each word stabbed deep. Her mother had waited, had hoped, but he never came, and now 20 years later, she was just discovering. He had been named in her life all along, but chose absence. She turned to him, eyes brimming with tears she could no longer hold back. "You didn't answer me, because no answer would ever be enough, right?" Lucien met her gaze, heavy with sorrow. But this time, he didn't look away. He nodded, and it was the first time he didn't try to justify anything. He didn't blame circumstance, career, or fear. He simply accepted it, all of it. And in that moment, amid the ache, the resentment, and the tightening in her chest, Arya understood one thing: she might be able to forgive, but not before she fully understood the truth, before she decided whether this man had earned the right to ever call her daughter. The afternoon wind blew harder than usual, scattering a few papers from Arya's hands as she followed Lucien to the bench behind the cafe, a secluded spot rarely visited. He no longer looked like the hunched, ragged old man. He sat straighter now, his voice low and steady, as if the time had come to strip away the disguise he had worn for days. The slanting sunset lit his face, etched with fatigue and regrets too old to be undone. "You have every right to be angry," Lucien began, eyes not quite meeting hers, "because the one who should have spoken up when you were born was me, and I stayed silent." Arya said nothing. She didn't nod or shake her head. She simply sat there, hands resting on her knees, waiting. Lucien continued his words, slow, but suffocating the air between them. "That year, I had just been appointed deputy director of Valencourt Holdings. My family wanted me to marry Alina Rousseau, the daughter of a powerful business partner. But I refused, because by then, I had fallen in love with a woman working at the public library, your mother." Arya clenched her hands. Her name was Genevieve. Beautiful, independent, brilliant. But she wasn't wealthy. She held no title, and to my family, that was a sin. Lucien raised his head and looked directly into his daughter's eyes, his voice tightening. "They hired people to follow her, framed her, spread rumors that Genevieve only pursued me for money. A week later, she was fired from the library. And the next day, I received an ultimatum: end it, or lose everything, my inheritance, my name. I fought back. But then, they forced me to sign an agreement. I was forbidden to contact Genevieve or go near her again, or they would have her deported from France for deceiving a businessman." Arya felt like she had been punched in the chest. "So, you chose your career." Lucien shook his head, and for the first time, his tears fell openly. "No. I chose to fight, but I fought the wrong way. By the time I returned to find her, she was gone. No address, no message. Every line of contact cut off. I lost her completely. For the next decade, I hired investigators, searched records, nothing. Until a year ago, when a junior staffer happened to mention a quiet cafe in the suburbs with a young waitress, whose eyes looked just like the woman in my photograph. I drove there myself. 3 hours, and I saw you." Arya's breath caught. Her hands fell to her sides, and instead of coming forward, "You pretended to be a beggar." Lucien nodded. "Because I wasn't sure. I was afraid you'd hate me. I needed to know who you were before asking for your forgiveness." A long silence wrapped around them. No wind, no traffic. Just two people sitting a hand's breadth apart, separated by a lifetime of misunderstandings, pain, and what-ifs. Arya looked at him, not with accusation, but with the deep conflict of a child who had grown up with an aching void, now face to face with the very man who allowed that emptiness to exist. And the story was only just beginning. By late afternoon, the sun had retreated behind the towering buildings, casting a cold grey hue across Arya's face. She shot up from the bench, fists clenched and trembling her chest, rising and falling with the fury that had been bottled up for far too long. Her voice cut through the air, not loud, but every word landed like a blade. "You had the whole world, a life of silk and gold, fame, power, a massive empire bearing your name. And what did I have?" She jerked her chin toward the narrow street, where the last of the buses had already taken exhausted workers home. What did I have? A mother who died when I was 14. A rented room that leaks every winter. Nights in college scrubbing floors, washing glasses just to afford textbooks. I'm a waitress, not because I dream of serving coffee to the rich, but because I had no one else to lean on. Lucien bowed his head. Not a word of protest, not a tear in defense. But Arya wasn't done. She stepped closer, closer than she had ever been to him. But her voice dropped, carrying a pain too sharp to name. And now you show up, dressed as a beggar, holding an old photo, looking at me like you have the right to hope I'll cry for you. Please, don't insult the years I lived invisible. Lucien still didn't raise his face, just a quiet nod, as if he accepted every ounce of her rage, as if this was the punishment he'd silently waited for over 20 years. Silence followed, thick and unrelenting. Arya didn't know if his pain was real or just another performance from a man too used to getting his way. But one thing she did know: her memories. The wounds of growing up in absence and struggle couldn't be stitched shut by a name in a will. She turned away, her steps slow but resolute, and just before she left, she spoke without looking back. If you really are my father, then you should know kindness is not something you give when it's convenient. It's something that's supposed to come in time. And Lucien, still seated, eyes lowered to the ground, had nothing left to say, because she was right. That wasn't a slap of the hand, but one so powerful it shattered his heart into silent pieces, too broken to ever fully mend. That evening, a soft rain fell. Droplets slid slowly down the window pane of the small room Arya called home. She didn't turn on the lights, letting only the glow of her old desk lamp illuminate the wooden box resting on the table, the one she had never dared to fully open all these years. The box belonged to her mother, a piece of memory Arya had always been too afraid to confront. But after the conversation today, she knew the time had come. The next morning, she returned to Maison Luna. There was no more anger in her expression, but neither was there forgiveness. She was simply a daughter, carrying a past she didn't choose but had always been forced to bear. Lucien was still there, on the same old bench, shoulders draped in a worn cloak, eyes no longer hopeful, only waiting. Arya placed the box in front of him. This belonged to my mother. She kept it for 10 years, then locked it away. I never knew why. Maybe she didn't want me to live forever, haunted by questions. Lucien opened the lid. Inside were handwritten letters, the paper yellowed with age, the familiar slanted script dancing across each page. Every letter began with the same line, Luciena, as if she still believed he would read them someday. Arya didn't look at him. She only read a short passage from the third letter, her voice slow, though her eyes were already glistening red. Today, Arya asked me, "Did Daddy ever love you?" I didn't know how to answer. I didn't want her to grow up bitter, but I couldn't lie and say her father fought for this love. So I told her that sometimes people do love, but are too weak to hold on to what matters most. Lucien lowered his head. His hand trembled as he touched each page, as if touching the years he had let slip away. No tears came, only a numbness deeper than any regret. Arya clasped her hands tightly, as if anchoring herself in the middle of a storm of emotions. She waited, even though she never said it, even though she never blamed you. But every letter here is an unanswered breath. Lucien nodded faintly, as if every word she spoke carved directly into his heart. There were no CEO titles now, no reputation, no legacy. In that moment, he was simply an old man, facing the truest cost of silence, the years in which love went unproven. And Arya stood there, Not the girl seeking revenge on the past, but a woman confronting her mother's legacy, a love that was real but incomplete. And she knew now she was the one writing the final chapter to that unfinished story. That morning, the 58th floor of Valencourt Capital's headquarters pulsed with tension. Assistants rushed down corridors, urgent summons were sent to all department heads, yet no one knew why. CEO Lucien Valencourt had returned after nearly a month of mysterious absence, and according to internal whispers, he had changed. The executive boardroom, normally reserved for those with seats on the council, was packed. The cold overhead lights cast sharp reflections across tense, confused faces. Lucien entered. No expensive suit, no tie. Just a plain white shirt, with the sleeves rolled up to his elbows. He didn't take the head chair. Instead, he stood tall in the center of the room, his voice steady and stripped of all corporate pretense. Today, we're not here to discuss quarterly earnings, not dividends, not M&A strategies. Today, I want to change the leadership structure of Valencourt Capital. The room buzzed with murmurs. One senior director raised a brow and muttered, "Another reform." Lucien didn't allow interruptions. He raised a hand and handed each person a printed personnel update. The first bolded line on the sheet made jaws drop. Independent financial advisor, Aria Leclerc. Some stood abruptly, others frowned. A director from the investments division whispered, "She never went to Wharton. Who even is she?" Lucien offered a faint smile, not smug, but the smile of a father finally brave enough to face a lifelong debt. "She doesn't have an MBA. She's never sat in an executive chair. But she knows how to see value in things others throw away. And there's one thing you all should learn from her: integrity when no one's watching, and kindness when no one's demanding it. She's my daughter." The room fell utterly silent. From seasoned board members to strategic consultants, no one spoke. A few faces flushed, perhaps recognizing her from Maison Luna, the girl they'd once walked past without a second glance. Lucien continued, "If Valencourt Capital wants to survive, not just with wealth, but with honor, then it's time we relearn our first lesson. Everyone has value, but not everyone is seen. I choose to see her, and I ask all of you to do the same." The meeting ended without applause, but as Lucien walked out, a few members rose to their feet. Not because he was the CEO, but because for the first time in his tenure, they saw the father behind the title. And the name Aria Leclerc, once stitched into a coffee-stained apron, now rang out like the start of something new. A quiet, powerful declaration: the past cannot be changed, but the present is a chance to make things right. The grand lobby of Valencourt Capital was a place where every step was measured by reputation or bank balance. Towering glass ceilings, a reception desk carved from white marble, and rows of assistants in sharp suits glided by as if even breathing was a luxury they couldn't afford, let alone stopping to notice someone. That day, Aria walked in no makeup, no designer bag. Just a crisp white shirt, navy slacks, and a pair of worn-down flats. In her hand was an appointment badge labeled Independent Financial Consultant, Aria Leclerc. But a badge is just a badge. The receptionist glanced at her, then immediately looked back down at the computer, pretending not to see. Near the espresso machine, a group of marketing staff exchanged looks. A young man snorted, trying to lower his voice, but loud enough for Aria to hear. "Must be a delivery. Never seen a consultant with shoes that beat up." Another whispered to the head of finance, Ronald Blake, a man infamous for his quiet discrimination and unshakable arrogance. "Word is the CEO brought in some relative, probably a housemaid's niece." Ronald didn't laugh. He strode over, blocking Arya's path, scanning her from head to toe like inspecting a defective product. "Excuse me, are you here to clean the conference room or drop lunch off for the accounting team? If so, I can call someone to receive it." Arya tightened her grip on her bag strap. Her heart pounded, not with fear, but with familiarity. She knew this look. She had lived her life behind that look, judged by cheap fabric, hurried hairstyles, and quiet dignity. She looked up, her eyes calm, not angry, but composed, weighted with quiet strength. "I'm here on orders from CEO Valencourt, and I suggest you read the consultant list more carefully before belittling someone." Ronald froze. A few assistants looked up, stunned. Arya pulled out her badge and placed it on the scanner in front of the receptionist. Instantly, the screen lit up in bold red text. "Access Level 7, Executive Consultant." The entire lobby fell silent. Arya said nothing more. She gave a soft smile, not smug, but the smile of someone who had been underestimated her entire life and was finally walking forward without having to bow her head. She walked across the vast hallway, her worn shoes clicking steadily against the marble floor. Each step was a quiet rebuttal that needed no words. "I didn't come here to be accepted. I came to prove I always belonged." The tension still clung to the air after Arya's badge lit up the scanner when the special elevator on the west side slid open. No introduction was needed. Everyone recognized him at once. Lucien Valencourt had arrived. He wore a deep grey suit shirt collar, undone his pace, slow but commanding, like a man who knew every step he took would shift the gravity in the room. Senior directors stood up immediately, and a few assistants straightened their ties in a panic. But Lucien paid them no mind. He walked straight to the center of the lobby, his gaze sweeping across the room with cold precision, as if seeing through every polished smile and polite nod. Then his eyes settled on Arya, still standing there, worn shoes, hands slightly trembling, but eyes unwavering. Lucien spoke not loudly, but his words slammed through the room like a hammer, shattering a thin pane of glass. "I know what you're all thinking, that she doesn't belong here, that the name Arya Leclerc is just some reckless experiment, a personal whim." He turned to Ronald, whose jaw still hung slightly open from the shock. Then he looked around at the entire lobby. "Then listen and remember this. She is my daughter, but I didn't choose her because of blood. I chose her because of character." Lucien pulled out a printed financial report and raised it. In just 3 weeks of observing the local market, she identified a chain of errors in our Midwest branch structure. Alone, she produced a comprehensive report that our entire analysis team hadn't completed in 3 months. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink into each stunned face. "And more than that, while some of you still treat the poor as invisible, she's the one who saw value in what others chose to overlook." Lucien drew a deep breath, then delivered each word like a strike of iron. "If Valencourt Capital is a building made of glass, then I'd rather let it collapse than keep it standing with hollow pride." The wall of silence shattered. Some lowered their heads, some flushed with embarrassment. Ronald stepped back, fists clenched, exposed raw and seen for what he truly was. Lucien turned to Arya and extended his hand, not as a CEO, but as a father, publicly offering her not just a title, but his full and unconditional trust. And in that moment, in the grand marble lobby of prestige, wealth, and judgment, something truly collapsed. Not a physical wall, but the wall of arrogance, assumptions, and silent cruelty that had stood far too long in this place. The news exploded like sparks on dry straw. Just hours after Lucien's declaration at headquarters, financial media outlets lit up with sensational headlines. But the shock wasn't about him introducing his daughter, it was her identity, her past, and the elite's reaction that caused uproar. A notorious tabloid Market Pulse Raw splashed a flaming red headline across its front page. Wall Street titan loses his mind over unvetted cafe. Girl beneath it was a candid shot of Aria taken a few days earlier as she left Maison Luna holding a paper bag of sandwiches for a homeless man. The angle was deliberately unflattering, designed to make her look scruffy inferior. But the cruelest blow came from within. A special shareholder meeting was summoned that very afternoon. Inside the boardroom, Martin Cohen, the third largest shareholder, slammed his hand on the polished table. "We're handing the future of this company to some uneducated stray dragged in from a roadside cafe." Another, Lorraine Whitfield, a third-generation heiress with a tone as icy as her diamonds, added coldly, "I didn't invest in family sentiment. I invested in strategy. And this is a catastrophic miscalculation." Lucien sat opposite them, face unmoved. But beside him, Aria, stepping into her first high-level boardroom, felt the storm of judgment whip straight at her. Every word was a blade slicing through her self-worth. She had faced those eyes before, in diners behind checkout counters, in classroom corners. But today, amid leather chairs, gleaming ebony tables, and glass walls overlooking Manhattan's skyline, the sting was deeper. Lucien rose, his gaze sweeping the room like steel. "If you think I chose her out of sentiment, then let me ask, which one of you has ever walked 3 hours in the snow just to meet a single mother who here has ever handwritten a 50-page report because they couldn't afford a printer, who has worked 14 hours straight and still found time to help someone else?" He pointed at the distorted photo of Aria on the screen. "I haven't lost my mind. I'm clearer than I've ever been. It's you who've become so drunk on power, you've forgotten what character looks like." The room fell into a heavy silence. But Aria knew this battle was far from over. She wasn't fighting a person. She was standing against a system long used to measuring worth by family legacies and Ivy League diplomas. And she understood to hold her ground. Here, she couldn't rely on logic alone. She needed the courage of someone who had lived unseen and the heart of someone who had once been left behind. She didn't need rage-filled rebuttals. She didn't need to shout to reclaim her dignity. Aria chose a different path, one that made the entire room sit down and listen. Not because they respected her, but because they had no other choice. The next day, she requested a short presentation during the strategic planning meeting. Many smirked, expecting a little performance by the boss's daughter. But just 3 minutes after she clicked on her first slide, the atmosphere shifted completely. In the past 24 months, Aria began, her voice calm and composed. 3 so-called breakthrough investments have shown clear signs of accounting fraud. She didn't read from notes. She had no assistant. It was just her and the numbers she had gathered, analyzed and cross-checked through sleepless nights using an old laptop and the sharp skepticism of someone who was never taught to accept appearances. The Solentra tech deal, approved by Deputy CFO Ronald King, involved artificial cash flows funneled through 3 shell companies registered in the Cayman Islands. I reviewed their tax records. None existed beyond the 6th month of the transaction. The screen changed charts, detailed spreadsheets, transaction codes, and forgotten emails lit up the room. Each piece of evidence was laid bare before the board. The second deal, Evergrande Holdings. Its reported net earnings were triple the actual figures. I re-examined their asset insurance policies, revalued the inflated building in question. It was sold off 8 months ago. Shareholders who had sat upright began lowering their eyes. Some turned toward Ronald, his face now ghostly pale. The man who once asked if she was a food delivery girl had nothing left to say. And now the third aria paused, letting the room breathe, personally approved by Ms. Lorraine Whitfield. Lorraine froze. The final slide appeared a series of real estate investments that seemed wildly profitable but were in truth a manipulation of land values through front companies. Aria looked around the room, not with contempt, not with triumph, but with the quiet certainty of someone who didn't need to crush anyone to prove she belonged. I'm not here to be accepted because of who I'm related to. I'm here to show you that sometimes the person you underestimate is the only one willing to face the truth you've avoided for 2 years. The room was silent. Lucien looked at his daughter, not with pride in the traditional sense, but with the quiet ache of a father who knew he had been right, and yet felt the sting of realizing his daughter had grown strong through scars. That day, no one dared to mention the words illegitimate or coffee shop again. They simply looked at the new name on the screen, Aria Leclerc, and understood. From now on, she wouldn't need the Valencourt name to make them tremble. 1 week after the boardroom upheaval, a press conference was held at the Valencourt Capital headquarters. Lights from dozens of cameras illuminated the podium, not to attack, distort, or sensationalize, but to witness a historic moment of transition. Lucien Valencourt, the man once hailed as the cold mind of Wall Street. The titan who had guided the firm through 3 financial crises stood tall in a deep grey suit, perfectly composed, until his eyes turned to the young woman standing beside him. Aria, no grand speech, no PR theatrics. Lucien simply said, "I built an empire with numbers, but I lost the 2 most valuable decades of my life by not being there when a little girl needed her father." He turned to Aria, his voice slow, restrained. She didn't just correct the balance sheets, she corrected the heart of a man who thought he'd forgotten how to feel. And that is something no trillion-dollar portfolio could ever buy. He placed a hand on her shoulder, then faced the media and shareholders. "I hereby announce my retirement, not out of weakness, but because I've done the last thing a true leader should do, pass the future to someone more worthy than himself." The room held its breath. Then the LED screen behind them lit up with a bold message, launching the Aria Fund, a foundation for abandoned futures. Lucien didn't hand Aria the CEO title. He let her choose her own path, and she chose not to sit atop the financial pyramid, but to build a bridge for those who had been left behind. The Aria Fund was announced as a non-profit foundation launched with an initial capital of $200 million dedicated to supporting single mothers who had been shunned or denied education. Disadvantaged students are cast out of the system for lacking powerful sponsors. Young women are forced to choose between backbreaking labor and abandoned dreams. American media erupted. Newspapers that once labeled Aria as the daughter climbing on her father's name now rewrote their headlines, "The heir who refused the throne to build a kingdom for the forgotten." Lucien stepped down from the stage silent and took a seat in the front row, not as a CEO, but as a father. He was no longer the man who led the world. He was a man who had finally found his daughter, and knew that from now on he didn't need to change the world, because she had already begun to do so, from the inside, with a heart unafraid to be broken. When all legal procedures were finalized, the corporate communications team made a suggestion: we should announce her new name as Aria Valencourt to officially affirm the relationship and strengthen long-term influence and prestige. They didn't expect that the same girl who once quietly wrapped sandwiches for the homeless would now answer them with a voice so calm it chilled the room. "No, I am Aria Leclerc, and I will always be Aria Leclerc. Silence swept the room. A few tried to persuade her again. The name Valencourt carries weight. It's a brand, a legacy, a key that opens all other doors. But Aria gave a soft smile, and for the first time during a live-streamed shareholder meeting, she shared a memory buried for over 20 years. When I was little, I once asked my mother, "Mom, why do all my friends have their dad's last name? But I don't." She didn't answer at first. Then she kissed my forehead and said, "Because you are the most beautiful thing I ever got to keep, even when everything else was taken away." Aria paused, her voice steady, but full of weight. If my mother chose to carry a name, the world pitied, and still held her head high to raise me with dignity, then I will carry that name for the rest of my life so that everyone knows what truly deserves to be honored. Lucien sat in the front row. He didn't object. He wasn't disappointed. He simply reached into his pocket, pulled out a small, worn photo of a young Aria kept safe all these years by her mother, and for the first time, smiled at a choice he couldn't control, but knew in his heart was the truest one. Aria didn't need the Valencourt name to be great. She chose to keep the name her mother had carried alone for 2 decades as a banner of honor for every forgotten woman who refused to be erased. And when she stepped out of that hall that day, the door didn't close behind her. It opened wide for a new generation to follow. At the Global Economic Forum in Geneva, a stage once reserved for legendary names like Elon Musk and Christine Lagarde, a new voice rose before thousands. Aria Leclerc, founding director of the Aria Fund, daughter of former CEO Lucien Valencourt, and the first woman ever invited to deliver a plenary keynote without having held the title of CEO at any corporation. She stepped onto the stage not in a designer gown, not in luxury brands, but in her late mother's plain white blouse, carrying a handwritten draft. No teleprompter, no speechwriter, only her heart. Her voice wasn't loud, but each word struck deep like a hammer against the cold fortress of the global financial elite. Some people are born with gold-embossed business cards. I was born with an unpaid utility bill and a note that read, "Mom will be home late. Eat first, sweetheart." I once had to choose between paying for tutoring and buying the last loaf of bread that day. I cried because I couldn't submit an assignment on time without Wi-Fi. But it was those hungry nights, the dishwashing shifts, and the judgmental stares while delivering food that taught me what Harvard never could: to be human before being a boss, to be kind before being successful, and to never judge someone by the shoes they wear, but by how they walk through adversity. The hall rose in applause. On social media, clips from her speech spread rapidly with hashtags like "Born to Billions, but chose to serve," "From Receipt to Respect," and "Area Effect." A veteran economic journalist wrote in a column the next morning, "That night, Geneva didn't listen to a financier. They listened to a human being." And perhaps in that moment, Aria wasn't just acknowledged by the world, she made the world rethink what success means and who truly deserves a seat at the table of leadership. At the top floor of the Aria Fund's new headquarters, the meeting room named Solstice was designed with minimalist yet deeply emotional intent. No flashy logos, no million-dollar art, just natural light pouring through the glass ceiling, a long wooden table, and a single empty chair placed at the head of the table beside the seat of the executive director. On the chair's armrest, delicately hand-carved in slender, italic letters, was a single line that made everyone stop and read slowly: "For the one who loved without being loved back." No one asked Aria what it truly meant, but everyone knew it was her final tribute to her mother. Strangely, the person who sat in that chair most often was Lucien Valencourt. Every Monday morning he arrived earlier than anyone else. No more designer suits. Just an aging man, quietly listening. He never spoke, never led. He opened a notebook and wrote down every word as Arya presented projects, defended strategies, and analyzed risk. Once, when a senior advisor suggested replacing the chair with a new piece of tech equipment, Arya simply replied, "That chair reminds us all some people gave their entire lives so others could sit here, and so the chair remained. Untouched, untouchable. No one was allowed to occupy it, not even when the room was filled with heads of state, global investors, or renowned economic scholars." To Lucien, the chair wasn't just a seat. It was the quietest yet truest form of repentance he could offer to the woman who had loved him unconditionally and to the daughter who had forgiven him without ever demanding an apology. And in that silence was an entire life finally redeemed. No one saw Arya seek revenge. She never returned to Maison Luna to boast. She never called out the names of those who once mocked her in the Valencourt lobby. She didn't post luxury photos. She didn't go on TV to recount her struggles. She simply rewrote history with the name Arya Leclerc, a name that didn't bear the weight of her powerful father's legacy. A name once printed on overtime slips, scholarship applications, and even late electricity bills. But that very name, now engraved on the gates of the Arya Fund, studied in economic textbooks, and printed on an invitation letter from the United Nations Forum for Emerging Global Leaders. Arya didn't need to stand on a stage and shout that she had won. She let her actions whisper it, through fair wages paid to every employee, through each scholarship granted to an abandoned child, and through the quiet moment once a week when she would walk into a shelter and gently place into the hands of a young waitress the silk scarf her mother once knitted. Arya's story didn't end with applause. It ended with stillness, the kind that arrives when a woman no longer needs to prove herself. But the entire world listens anyway. And if there's one thing Lucien Valencourt, once the head of a financial empire, left behind after stepping off the stage, it was the line he wrote in his only memoir: "You don't need a wealthy father to be worthy, but a wealthy father will learn humility if he's ever hurt a child who deserved to be loved from the very beginning." And you know something. Sometimes the most beautiful things come from what's broken. Arya didn't grow up in silk. She wasn't taught to say "Dad" with trust in her voice. But those years of hunger, of skipping meals to buy books, of dozing off during late shifts, forged a woman who didn't need approval to know her worth. She didn't seek love to fill a void. She built an empire of compassion and wisdom in the space where love had once been missing. And in the end, the very man who once turned away from her chose to sit in the back row, silent, listening just as she had once longed for someone to simply be there, to listen. This story isn't just about a father and daughter. It's about us humans wounded, yet capable of choosing not to pass that wound on to others. That is power. That is victory. And if your heart is trembling right now because you feel it too, then stay with Toch's story. Because there are still so many journeys waiting to be told, so many wounds still aching for healing, and so many people like you, ready to stop turning away from the pain of others. Because sometimes you don't need a miracle to change a life. You just need one person who is kind enough, strong enough, and loving enough not to abandon you when you're at your weakest. And if you've ever been that person, or are waiting for someone like that to walk into your life, then the story of Arya Leclerc is your reminder. Don't stop believing in the power of kindness. Not flashy reward-seeking kindness, but the quiet kind, like how Arya once left a bag of bread for an old homeless man. not knowing that small act would unlock a whole new fate. This world can be cold and unjust, but one act of compassion at the right moment for the right soul can warm a heart for a lifetime. And if this video helped you see that more clearly than ever, then leave a period, a thank you, or a story you've witnessed because it might be the reason someone still believes in humanity. Dear friend, if you're still here after everything that unfolded between Arya Leclerc and Lucien Valencourt, then perhaps you didn't just watch a story. You walked through a journey, the journey of a daughter once abandoned, living in the shadow of silence, desperately searching for answers in faded memories and an old photograph. And you also walked beside a father-man who once chose silence out of fear, who paid for it with a lifetime of solitude, only to realize that some losses can never truly be repaid. The greatest lesson here isn't found in tears or wealth or reputation. It lies in the courage to forgive and the strength to love even those who once made you hurt. Arya didn't forgive because she was weak, but because she was strong enough not to let old wounds shape her future. She didn't change her name to be accepted. She kept her mother's, an unwavering declaration to the world that those who raise us with love and sacrifice are the ones worth carrying with us for life. This story is also a wake-up call for parents, children, or anyone who's lived through a fractured family. It says, to love someone isn't to give them wealth, but to show up when they need you most. A hug on a rainy night. A kind word when the scholarship falls short. A simple dad's here when everything is crumbling. Sometimes those things are worth more than any will inheritance or late apology. Lucien Valencourt, once called the King of Wall Street, chose to leave quietly in the end. He didn't leave his daughter a kingdom, but a foundation named after her, as if to say, I can't turn back time, but I can make sure no one else grows up alone the way you did. And when he sat quietly in the chair, marked for the one who loved without being loved back, we understood remorse doesn't need to be spoken. It needs to be lived. And sometimes it takes a lifetime to cleanse. Arya, the girl who once asked, are you here to deliver food, in her father's headquarters, stood before the World Economic Forum and said the words that made thousands fall silent. I wasn't born to be accepted. I exist to remind the world that human worth isn't about where you begin. It's about how you rise. And perhaps that's why you're still here, feeling something ache in your chest, because somewhere you too were once the child crying in a room where no one heard, or the grown-up carrying a regret you couldn't put into words. So if this story made you cry, it's okay. If it made you go quiet for a while, also okay. But if it made you want to live more kindly, to love more deeply, or to finally gather the courage to say sorry, or to forgive, then this wasn't just a video. It was a gift. And if you feel your heart has just been touched, do something to pass it on. Leave a comment for a single mother, a silent father, a child growing up without a name being called. Click like. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. And don't forget to subscribe to Toch Story, where every story isn't just a narrative, but a hand reaching out to those who've once felt forgotten. Because sometimes you don't need the whole world to understand you. You just need one person who doesn't walk away. And if this story helped you remember that person, then we've done our part.